Ms. Richards, before we begin today, let me just say a few words. First, if you'll bear with me, Professor Ludlam, to the general public and others who are watching this remotely. For this week and the next, the inquiry will be turning its spotlight on clinicians who worked in Edinburgh and Glasgow. This is a UK-wide public inquiry. It has already considered the centres in Cardiff, Oxford, Birmingham, Swansea, Sheffield and London, and some other centres in England. Belfast is yet to come. But if the spotlight of the inquiry this week is on Edinburgh and Scotland, there is a spotlight in the world today on AIDS. Today is World AIDS Day. No one could doubt the serious threat that COVID-19 poses to all of us. Indeed, is the reason we have to take the evidence in the manner which reduces the risks. But we should not forget, even as deaths from COVID approach 1.5 million worldwide, that nearly 33 million people worldwide have so far died of AIDS. Any untimely death is a tragedy. It is not a statistic. A death from AIDS often involves long, drawn-out suffering, not just for the person infected. A main task of this inquiry is to determine how and why so many being treated by the NHS suffered like this. The proportion of the global number may be small, though significant, but each and every one who suffered or continues to suffer is a real person, not simply a statistic, wherever they are in the UK. You might like to know that my team and I will never forget that. So as I say, Professor Ludlam, today we're talking about Scotland. Let me just set the scene for you before I ask you to take the oath. You, I understand, are on your own in a room in Edinburgh, I think at your solicitor's, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And in your counsel, Mr. Reid and your solicitor are in a separate room. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, next door.
Here, because you won't be able to see much more than me and Ms. Richards when she asks you questions, here there is a very large hearing chamber which is largely empty. There are 4 counsel team in it. There is Shumik, who is there to make sure that you get, or we and the general public see the right documents. And we have 3 other people in the room, one of whom is Mary, who will now ask you to take the oath. You will be watched by around about a couple of hundred, I beg your pardon. I mustn't add noughts where they don't belong. A couple of hundred people who are watching remotely. It'll be there or thereabouts. It varies a little bit during the day, but it's a fairly constant number. And they will be watching, of course, all week because you will be with us all week. We'll take a break mid-morning. I'm grateful to you for agreeing to sit for the whole day today. The other 3 days will finish round about lunchtime, so give you a break overnight, because it's a long time to give evidence, and we appreciate that. Mary.
Please state your full name.
Could I say that I would like to affirm rather than take the oath? Is that
sure.
Understood?
Yeah.
That message would reach you.
Thank you. Christopher Armstrong Ludlam.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly sincerely,
I do solemnly and sincerely
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Professor Ludlam, are you able to see and hear me?
Good morning, Miss Richards. Yes, I can see you and hear you. Thank you.
But before we start with the main part of your evidence, the inquiry has received this morning a document apparently co-authored by you and Professor Lowe. It's entitled The Scottish Perspective on Healthcare Organisation, Management of Pandemics and Management of Haemophilia Care, and it purports to be on behalf of Scottish Haemophilia Centre directors past and present and their territorial health boards, and refers to some further 42 other documents. Professor Ludlam, so that you understand, I've not had time to read it, the Chair has not seen it, and no core participant or recognised legal representative will have done so because it arrived with the inquiry only this morning. In circumstances where the Rule 9 request for a statement was sent to you on the 12th of December last year, are you able to assist us with why this document is being sent to the inquiry now?
I think I and I think my colleague Professor Lowe have been very busy providing our statements, the full statements that we made. I recently, over the last 2 weeks, have been reading some of the many documents that have been sent electronically to me in relation to the inquiry and from the inquiry. It has taken quite a little while to put together this document and to get its support from, or to send it round to my colleagues and ex-colleagues in Scotland. And I'm sorry it's arrived at this late date. It's because of all the consultation to make sure that we have given a fair summary of how we see Scottish healthcare being rolled out over the last 50 or more years.
The inquiry...
So I'm sorry that it has arrived so late. I had anticipated, I had asked for it to be sent in sooner. It was out of my control with the Central Legal Office, who were primarily overseeing this.
The inquiry has been careful to ask for individual statements from individual Haemophilia Centre directors rather than collective documents or submissions. Are you able to tell us who asked you to produce this document?
I think it arose out of a discussion probably between Professor Lowe and the team at the Central Legal Office.
Well, you'll understand, Professor Ludlam, that I'm not going to be asking you questions about it, because not only have I not seen it, but our system provides that any statement should be seen by the very significant number of core participants and their recognised legal representatives so they can suggest questions, and no one else would have seen this document as yet.
Can I raise a more fundamental issue? What is the nature of the document? Is it evidence, or is it, in effect, submission?
That's a question for you, Professor.
Oh, I'm sorry. It is a submission in that it's a description.
Just stop, pause there.
Sorry.
Can I explain clearly so that you understand, and in particular the CLO who plainly played a part in producing this document so late in the day, what the right place for submission is? In an inquiry like this, the purpose of hearing evidence from you is to take evidence. Now, some of that evidence naturally does involve someone expressing their own views where they are relevant to the question which is being asked. But it's question-driven. This is an inquiry asking its own questions of witnesses who will be able to say what the facts are. You are not called as an expert, even though you have obviously expertise, which is why you've been in the position you have, and great expertise too, judging in particular by the number of documents and articles which you yourself have been responsible for. But this is not the right place to make a submission, particularly when only part of the evidence is in. In due course, there will be a chance for you to advise the CLO, no doubt, and to discuss with them, if you wish, matter for you, what they want to say to me at the end of the day. And they may want to persuade me about the nature of Scottish healthcare and whether it did or didn't go wrong. If it did go wrong, why and where. If it did things right, why and where. If the rest of the UK might have benefited by doing what Scotland did, we shall learn from that too. But the right place for that is at the end for submission, where submissions will be dealt with in a manner we have yet to finally determine, but I would expect them to be shared by others. You can see what others are saying, answer it. They can see what you're saying and answer it. That's the fair and proper way of doing it. And it seems to me it is entirely wrong, and the CLO ought to have realised this, entirely wrong for this document to be produced now. It looks as though, I'm sure it wasn't intended this way, it looks as though it's an attempt to preempt some of the discussion. Well, it isn't, and Ms. Richards will ask you the questions that she had in mind. I don't expect this document to have any further currency in this inquiry. You can revise it as much as you like before the end. I won't read it until then because I don't see any proper evidential basis for doing so. If your counsel wishes to persuade me otherwise, I'm prepared to listen, and I will do so tomorrow afternoon once you finish your evidence, if he wants to say anything to me about it. But for the moment, I'm not very happy that the document was put forward. I don't necessarily blame you for it, but you're party to it. And I won't read it, and I shall expect to have submissions in the proper place at the end of the hearing. Thank you.
Professor Ludlam, I'm going to start by asking you about your career. You undertook house officer work at the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh 1971 to 2. Did that work involve the treatment of patients with bleeding disorders?
With the 6 months of medicine in Professor Girdwood's unit, that involved some general medicine, but the ward was the ward that received patients with bleeding disorders, yes.
So how much experience did you have in that time of working with patients with bleeding disorders?
It was mainly at an operational level, dealing mostly with inpatients, admitting them to the ward if they needed to come into a bed, and to putting up drips on them, arranging investigations, their general medical management. As a house officer, I had very little part in deciding, if you like, their management.
And was Dr. Davis at that point the director of the Haemophilia Centre in Edinburgh?
Dr. Davis and Professor Girdwood, I think they were joint directors.
Now, your CV tells us that between 1972 and 1975, you were an MRC Junior Research Fellow in the Department of Therapeutics at the Royal Infirmary. Briefly, can you tell us what that entailed?
Yes, as a student, I did a project in the blood transfusion centre in the hospital, setting up an assay for a blood clotting factor. And I became quite interested as a result of that in blood clotting. I was became particularly interested in platelets, which I'm sure you're aware are small cells in the blood that stop you bleeding. There was an opportunity to do some research. I applied for the job. It's a 3-year job, partly because it gave me some security for 3 years, because most junior hospital doctors are only for a year. I just got married. My wife had an interesting and a good job, and we didn't want to move around the country. So if I was able to get a 3-year post, that was advantageous. The work I did was on platelet aggregation, and I became particularly interested in platelet-specific proteins, and it was in the setting up of an assay for one of those that I learnt the importance of collaborating with other people to solve problems. I did a little bit of work also with some of the DDAVP analogues, and that's how I became interested in DDAVP, because at this time Dr. Cash was doing his original work with DDAVP, demonstrating that it not only caused the rise in factor rate, but also increased the dissolution of blood clots. And it was his work that led on to Professor Manucci using DDAVP in the treatment of haemophilia that he published in 1977. That's a well-known paper.
So is it right to say that that work between 1972 and 1975 was essentially laboratory work rather than clinical work?
No. More than half the time, I would think, would be clinical work. I helped manage the patients in the ward, 2 wards. There's a male and female ward. I was doing outpatient clinics, both in general medicine and a specialist one in haematology. I had responsibility as what we call the on-call waiting registrar. So all the emergency medical admissions that came to accidents and emergency on the days when our unit was responsible for them, I was down in casualty seeing them. I was the person overnight who had to deal with all the acute medicine that came in. So I did, in fact, a lot of acute medicine, a little bit of haematology in those 3 years, but it was really a way of getting general medical experience in a general medical ward.
You moved to Cardiff in 1975, and you worked under Professor Bloom in the Haemophilia Centre in Cardiff as a senior registrar from 1975 to 1979.
That's correct.
How much time did you spend treating patients with bleeding disorders during those years?
The training I received in Cardiff was in a rotation around the department. And like most departments of haematology, the vast bulk of the work, clinical work, is malignant work, leukemias and lymphomas. And so a lot of my time was spent doing that work, both as outpatients and up on the ward. We rotated about every 6 months, but 6 months was also spent in the laboratory, reporting blood films and bone marrows, and about 6 months was spent taking responsibility as a senior registrar for the blood bank. The time spent in coagulation might have been probably about a year. I'd be attached specifically to Professor Bloom, but because of my interest in clotting, and I was able to continue a little bit of my research activity there, I was, if you like, more familiar with what was going on in the coagulation laboratory because of my interest. So although I may only have spent perhaps a year attached to Professor Bloom's service, I was more in touch with what was happening in clotting in general, I think it would be fair to say.
What, if anything, do you recall of Professor Bloom's approach to treatment and the use of factor concentrates?
Professor Bloom was a very cautious individual. I remember him talking to me on a number of occasions about the Bournemouth hepatitis outbreak that occurred in 1974, and how patients, when they were first exposed, particularly to American concentrates, got hepatitis. And as I'm sure you will recall, at least one patient died shortly after receiving treatment. A goodly number of patients developed overt and quite serious hepatitis. Many more developed asymptomatic hepatitis. And it was very, very thoroughly investigated, as you'll recall, by Dr. Krask. He did a superb piece of sort of viral epidemiology in investigating the outbreak, leading to several very important publications. And this was clearly a very important event. I didn't, if you like, appreciate it at the time. It was Professor Bloom talking about it that really drew my attention to it. He was cautious about US American concentrates. We used cryoprecipitate. We used NHS factor VIII. We used latterly commercial factor VIII. The difficulty sometimes was when you went to the fridge to get the factor VIII out, you weren't quite sure what was going to be there, and particularly in terms of NHS factor VIII, the deliveries were very, as far as I could see, irregular, and you couldn't predict when the next one was going to be. It seemed a bit spasmodic and not terribly satisfactory. But that was, I think, the factor VIII came through the local blood transfusion service, where, of course, I had an attachment.
Were there patients in Cardiff during your time there on home treatment?
There were. I think it started in about 1976 or 77. A Hemophilia sister was appointed, and I think it was she who took forward the sort of home treatment arrangements for patients. I can't remember before that whether there was home treatment.
And were there patients receiving prophylactic treatment in Cardiff during the years that you were there?
There might well have been short-term prophylaxis. In other words, if a patient had a series of bleeds into an individual joint, an individual knee or elbow in fairly quick succession, one of the ways of trying to settle the joint down would be to give factor VIII injections every other day, or perhaps every day, for 2 or 3 weeks to let the joint settle down and heal up. You then stop the prophylaxis. So that was short-term prophylaxis, and I'm sure that we used that for some patients.
Did Professor Bloom remain someone to whom you turned for advice in the later part of your career once you were in Edinburgh?
Very much so. He was a world authority on haemophilia. He was very well informed. I respected his opinion. He was a very conscientious individual. He's a very kind person. And while I'm talking about him, if I may, I would fully endorse what Dr. Saad Ismail had to say about Professor Bloom and the respect that he held him in. I couldn't have put it better myself.
Well, I may ask you some further questions about the extent to which you and Professor Bloom discussed matters as we go through the various issues. Picking up your career in 1980, you became consultant haematologist and director of the Haemophilia Centre at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary in that year.
Yes.
And you remained in that post until you retired from the NHS in 2011.
That's correct, yes.
Now, your statement refers to there having been another consultant colleague at that time, but is it right to say that insofar as bleeding disorder patients were concerned, decisions about treatment, product usage, testing and so on, those decisions were your responsibility?
Yes.
You were a member of the UK HCDO throughout your time at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, and you were in fact a member of the Reference Centre Directors Group from 1980.
Yes.
You were on the Hepatitis Working Party, which was led by Dr. Krask, also from 1980.
Yes.
And on the AIDS Group from its inception in 1985.
Yes, as were all the other reference centre directors.
And you were chair of UK HCGO from 96 to 1999.
Yes.
You were on the Haemophilia Society's Medical Advisory Panel from 1989 to 1992.
Yes.
And you provided an expert report on HIV infection in haemophiliacs as part of the haemophilia HIV litigation, I think. Was that at the request of the Department of Health in England?
No, I think it was on behalf of the English health authorities.
Since your retirement in 2011, you've advised a number of pharmaceutical companies. Your statement tells us, I think they are Ipsen, Sobi, Roche and Biomarin.
That's correct, yes.
I want to ask you next about the Edinburgh Centre, and my questions are going to focus on 1980 to about 1987 for the most part in this regard. Can you recall how and when the centre in Edinburgh became a reference centre or treated as if it were a reference centre?
The situation in Scotland was slightly different from England. In Scotland, there were haemophilia centres in Edinburgh, Dundee, Inverness, Glasgow Royal Infirmary and Glasgow Children's Hospital, York Hill. And they were called regional haemophilia centres, and they were all considered to be, if I can put it this way, equal. There wasn't any tiering of the system at all. I think you may be coming to the issue about how the directors of Glasgow and Edinburgh came to be on the reference centre committee. There were some discussions with the Scottish Home and Health Department in early 1980s, 1980 or 1981, because Dr. Forbes and I were keen to attend the reference centre directors' meetings, and the Scottish Government, Scottish Home and Health Department, was keen that all haemophilia centres in Scotland should be seen as equal, and that there shouldn't be seen to be a two-tier system of Edinburgh and Glasgow and the smaller centres. So a way of circumventing this was that Dr. Forbes and I could attend the reference centre director meetings.
Well, just
is that clear? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we'll just look at a couple of documents to see if that assists.
Please.
Seamus, could we have HCDO 405, please? HCDO 0000405. Sorry? Yes, that's what this needs. Oh, I see. Sorry. A temporary technical problem in terms of sharing the document screen with you, Professor. We'll just sort that out, I hope. Let's try again, Seamus. Can you see the document, Professor?
I can, yes.
Good.
Thank you.
So this is a 10th meeting of UK Haemophilia Reference Centre Directors, 26th of October 1980. The list of names includes your own, and this would presumably have been your first meeting.
That's correct, yes.
And if we just turn, please, Seamus, to page 6. If we could have section 5 downwards, please, Seamus, so I can see the whole of that. So I'm just going to read out the relevant section. Haemophilia reference centres in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Professor Blackburn said that patients had raised with him the question of haemophilia reference centres in Scotland and Northern Ireland. There were at present no official reference centres in either Scotland or Northern Ireland, and some patients were very worried about this. Professor Bloom referred to the DHSS leaflet published in 1976. Professor Bloom said that in 1975 to 76, it had been agreed in Scotland that there should not be any officially designated reference centres in Scotland, although unofficially the centres in Edinburgh and Glasgow acted as reference centres. Northern Ireland was included in the Oxford supra-region, and Belfast was the only haemophilia centre in Northern Ireland. After some discussion, it was suggested that Belfast should be regarded as the reference centre for Northern Ireland, and that Dr. Ritzer should write to Dr. Main, etc. This was agreed. It was also agreed that the Department of Health should be asked to put Edinburgh and Glasgow as the Scottish reference centres and Belfast as the Northern Ireland reference centre. We go to the top of the next page, please, Seamus. First few lines only. In the list of UK haemophilia centres when this was reprinted. And then it says this: Dr. Ludlam asked that the Lothian Health Board should receive a copy of the letter to the Department of Health, as this would help him in his negotiations with the board. What did you mean by negotiations with the board, Professor?
I think it was trying to establish with the board the importance of the haemophilia centre and the haemophilia service I was starting or would be starting to develop.
So you and Dr. Forbes, in any event, attended the reference centre director meetings. Had Dr. Forbes been attending them prior to 1980, to your knowledge?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
And then if we go to one further document, please, Seamus, it's PRSE 40144. We can see this is a meeting of directors of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and Haemophilia directors, 30th of January 1981. If we could just go to page 4, please, Seamus, bottom half of the page. We can see that there is a heading there, proposal for recognition of Edinburgh and Glasgow haemophilia centres as reference centres. The chairman reported he'd received requests from Professor Bloom, chairman of the reference centre's director group, and also from Dr. Forbes and Dr. Ludlam, asking that the haemophilia centres in Edinburgh and Glasgow be designated as official reference centres. At the chairman's invitation, Dr. Forbes explained that in England and Wales, the designated reference centres were charged with a responsibility for coordinating the functioning of the haemophilia service. Many centres in England and Wales are relatively small and look to the larger reference centres for centres for guidance and advice. The proposal to designate the two largest centres as reference centres was simply to formalise the present situation whereby the directors of the Edinburgh and Glasgow centres attended meetings of the reference centre directors in the interests of UK coordination. Dr. Forbes also explained that internationally it was important that certain centres in the UK were recognised as reference centres for training purposes. Members agreed that this link with England and Wales was important and should be maintained, and it was confirmed that the directors of the other centres in Scotland, viz. Aberdeen, Dundee and Inverness, supported the proposal that Glasgow and Edinburgh should be regarded as reference, top of the next page please, centres. The chairman said that the department would wish to support this recommendation in regard to the status of the Edinburgh and Glasgow directors in the UK context, but the designation of these two centres as reference centres would require further consideration involving the CAMOs. Clearly this formalised an arrangement for you and Dr. Forbes to attend the reference centre director meetings. Was Edinburgh, as far as you're concerned, ever formally recognised or designated a reference centre?
I don't recall any further correspondence. The CAMOs were the chief administrative medical officers, the sort of chief administrative medical officers for each health board. And that, in my case, would be Lothian, and the one for Glasgow would be the Glasgow Health Board.
Other than involving your attendance at the reference centre director meetings and thus allowing a degree of coordination with England and Wales, did being designated as a reference centre have any further significance for you or for the centre?
Yes. It, if you like, increased the expectation that the Edinburgh and Glasgow centres should be seen as centres of excellence, and to conform to the health circular for England and Wales, HSC 764, which set out in some detail the responsibilities of haemophilia centres and I think reference centres in some detail. So it increased the expectation that we would lead haemophilia care, if I can put it that way, as best we could with the resources available. We were a teaching hospital, and that put an additional obligation on us to try and be at the forefront of investigations and therapy for haemophilia.
And did it mean that the smaller centres in the smaller centres in Scotland looked to Edinburgh and Glasgow for advice and guidance in the same way as these minutes describe smaller centres in England and Wales doing so?
When I was appointed in 1980, the directors in Dundee and Aberdeen were senior physicians and haematologists, very experienced, much more experienced than I was in haemophilia care. At one level, they had been looking after people with haemophilia for decades. So I was the new kid on the block, and so I didn't feel initially that it was my job to be, inverted commas, overseeing what happened in these other centres. As we went through the 1980s, a number of changes occurred. One of them was for the haemophilia directors in Scotland to meet regularly, initially as a subgroup of the Scottish Office SMBTS Haemophilia Directors Group that you referred to earlier. But from about 1985, I was invited by the Scottish Home and Health Department to chair the haemophilia directors for Scotland. And so we met every 2 or 3 months to discuss issues of mutual interest and concern in running and developing the service. So in that way, during the early mid-1980s, in a sense, there was greater communication and collaboration in Scotland between the haemophilia centres.
Now, in terms of the actual facilities in Edinburgh when you arrived, you've described them in your statement, and I'm not going to ask you to repeat that in any detail, but as I understand it from your statement, and indeed the evidence of others, there was essentially Ward 23 as an inpatient ward where patients would be admitted, and a small room at the entrance to the ward. And you've described that as suboptimal in relation to patient privacy, arrangements for managing patients, and availability of records. Is that right?
That is a brief description, yes. There was a room, I would think about 20 feet by 12 perhaps, with a sliding door, and it said Haemophilia Centre on the outside. Inside was, the room contained 2 quite comfortable reclining chairs where people could get infusions, a number of hard chairs, of dining style chairs where people could sit. It was a moderate sized room, and the patients would come up in their home when they were from home with bleeds, and would be treated in this room. I think it would be helpful to the inquiry if I was to perhaps say a little bit about the type of bleeding that patients were getting and that we had to manage in the haemophilia centre, because I think the history of what haemophilia was like in the 70s and 80s is almost lost. Personal experience of what it was like in those days. Severe haemophilia was a dreadful condition. It led to great uncertainties in the patients' lives. They didn't know when they were going to bleed. They didn't know how long if they did bleed. When they did bleed, they were going to have to wait for an ambulance to come up to hospital. They'd have to wait in hospital to get their treatment. They'd get their treatment, and wait for an ambulance to take them home again. It was a whole day's expedition. Bleeding into the joints can be extremely painful. An untreated bleed can last 10 days or so, and requires opiates often to deal with it. There also bleeds into muscles, and that can lead to the destruction of the muscle, and the bleeds into the joints lead to destruction of the joints, so that a appreciable number of the patients that I came to look after were very, very disabled. Their joints, particularly their elbows and knees, had very little movement in them. The knees would perhaps have 5 degrees, 10 degrees of movement. They'd be bent, and people would have to walk with bent knees. The calf muscles would have been destroyed from fibrosis following bleeds into the calf, because that was quite common. So these individuals ended up trying to walk on their toes with bent knees, and their arms were disabled because of bleeding into the elbows was common, led to the destruction of the elbow joint, and that became an appreciable problem when patients couldn't get their hand to their mouth to feed themselves. So the disability was huge, and I had the impression that the patients in Edinburgh when I arrived seemed to be rather more disabled than I remembered them in Cardiff. You've already heard about mortality. I experienced that very dramatically the first few years I was in Edinburgh. In 1981, 82, and 83, each year a young man came in with a fatal intracranial bleed and died. A terrible tragedy. And those 3 patients represented nearly 10% of my patients. It was a dreadful condition, severe haemophilia, that patients and their families, because as you know, there may have been 2 people, 2 brothers, for example, in a family, and certainly extended families, uncles may have had bleeding as well. And it really was a terrible condition to have. Its treatment became, as you know, with prophylaxis in the 1990s, so that children got injections every other day. They grew up virtually without bleeds. They hardly knew what it was to have a bleed. In fact, they didn't recognize when they got a bleed. Now, as I'm sure you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, there's new therapy in which an injection under the skin once a fortnight stops most people with severe haemophilia from bleeding. So it's a completely transformed condition now, that patients from small children up into adulthood can grow up only needing an injection once a fortnight and without experiencing bleeding. It is completely different, and I think the morbidity and mortality of the 1970s and 1980s, I think there aren't many people left, if I can put it that way, who remember it firsthand.
Professor Ludlam, can I just take you back to the question of facilities?
Yes.
You described the facilities as they were in 1980. Your statement tells us that in 1986, the centre was able to have a suite of rooms at the entrance to Ward 45. Can you recall how that was funded?
Well, the rooms in Ward 45, there was minimal costs involved. Another department had moved out of the rooms, and I think they may have needed a coat of paint and perhaps some new chairs. But the counselling rooms, which we urgently needed as you say, minimal. I'd had to raise money previously to improve the facilities in the haemophilia treatment room in Ward 23 because patients there were coming up, and in the mornings one would go around and see them, and they would sit round in a semicircle, 4 or 5 patients, and they'd tell you how they come or what the bleeding problem was. There was no privacy at all. It was awful. They knew each other most of them very well. That time we had a side ward in the ward of 4 beds. There was usually haemophiliac in each bed, and so patients would come up, go to the treatment room, get their treatment, and then go and see the patients who they knew well in the ward. So there was quite a community there. But as I indicated in my statement, my first endeavour was to improve the arrangements in this haemophilia room by getting a partition put up so that there was a tiny little consulting room where I could see each individual privately and examine them. And it also had the advantage that we could keep the medical records, at least the latest volume of medical records, in a couple of filing cabinets there. That was to try and give patients a bit more space and dignity.
In terms of staffing, you didn't have a haemophilia sister until 1982. And your statement tells us that clinical assistants and further nursing staff joined in 1986. Your statement then says that there was an associate specialist and further consultant later. Can you recall when those further posts were filled?
We initially, as you say, had clinical assistants. I think we had 2 appointed about 1985 or 86. And they worked for several years, 4 or 5, 6 years perhaps. And I think they left, rotated on to other appointments. And I think we used the funding for the what became the associate specialist post. The additional consultant post was separately funded. I wonder if I could go back. I think I have perhaps misunderstood your question about the consulting rooms. Were you asking about consulting rooms for counselling, or the move of the Haemophilia Centre to this new location?
I had asked about the move of the Haemophilia Centre to the new location in 86, simply how it was funded.
Oh, I'm sorry, because we initially moved to 2 of the rooms for counselling purposes, and then the centre moved a little while later because we were just desperate to try and get the service onto one site. That was funded by Lothian Health, as far as I recall. That required some building work, and was quite substantial.
Can you recall roughly when the further consultant joined you? Was it then in the 1990s?
I think it was about 19... I'm sorry, probably about 1996, 7 or 8.
Now,
I provided a statement. With my statement, there is an appendix listing the staff and when they were appointed. I could look at it if you wish.
Don't worry.
Just now.
No, don't worry. In terms of your role, I want to ask you about a paragraph in your witness statement. Seamus, it's WITN 3428001. And if we could go to page 7, please, paragraph 20. We can just see the whole paragraph 20. Thank you. So we can see, if we pick it up in the third line, you say at that time, so that when you were first appointed, as a consultant, my responsibility was to help lead the service, whereas today the emphasis is much more on consultants providing the service. Can you explain what that distinction is? What was it about your role in 1980 that's different from the role of the modern consultant?
What we haven't considered so far are all the other responsibilities that I had as a consultant. Managing the haemophilia service was only a very small part of my activity. I was mainly working as a clinical and laboratory hematologist with responsibility for diagnosing and treating patients with leukemia and lymphoma, both as inpatients and as outpatients, and overseeing their chemotherapy. I was involved with doing bone marrow transplants in some of my patients. So much of my time on the clinical side actually was spent looking after malignant patients, not individuals with haemophilia or bleeding disorders. I also had responsibility for overseeing initially the laboratory clotting service, which was a very large workload, and also providing advice around the hospital on patients with any hematological problems, but particularly with thromboses, bleeding. I was advising general practitioners. They would phone up and ask for advice. There'd be other consultants who would phone me up and ask for advice. There was a lot of what one might call multitasking. At the end of the day, I had to come and look at the abnormal blood films, report some of the bone marrows that had been sent in during the day. So haemophilia and clotting was only perhaps 1 day a week's worth of work, if one had to put it in those sort of terms. I had all these other activities to be responsible for.
And is that the distinction then you're making in paragraph 20?
Yes, so I'm sorry. To answer your question, I, in those days, had to, if you like, have more of a supervisory role and to try and ensure that the systems that were in place were reasonable and fit for purpose. And in particular, in relation to the Hemophilia service, the clinical assistants who were appointed in about 1985 or 86 did a lot of the routine review of the appointments of the clinics. If you like, under my supervision, they saw the patients on my behalf. That's the sense in which I was trying to convey that I was overseeing the service. Nowadays, of course, there are many more consultants, and so the consultants would be seeing the patients, if you like, rather than the clinical assistants.
If you were spending very approximately the equivalent of 1 day a week in relation to patients with clotting disorders in the first half of the 80s, can you assist us with how much time, again, approximately, you were spending on research work?
I had a contract when I took up my appointment. The university offered me what was called a part-time senior lecturer appointment of 2 sessions. That's 2 half days in the week. That was in recognition of the teaching that I was doing, which I haven't mentioned up to now. I was teaching both general medicine on the ward once a week, giving lectures to students and other health service staff and trainees. A lot of the research was squeezed into whenever you could. One would perhaps have lunchtime meetings with people, discuss things. A lot of it was, if it was reading and writing, it was done out of hours in the evening, the expense of my family, to which I owe a great debt for allowing me to do it. So there weren't any formal sessions that were set aside for university work in those days.
In terms of your research work as a whole, your academic work and research, what proportion of that approximately over your career has related to patients with bleeding disorders?
Can you still see me?
Yes.
You can?
Yes.
Fine. Something's happened to the screen here. I would say that most of my research for my career has been in relation to blood coagulation. And particularly blood safety and immune function, as we may come on to discuss later on. But I've done a significant amount of work, perhaps latterly, with other colleagues, particularly those interested in vascular medicine and thrombosis and the endothelial cells. So that's perhaps the latter part of my career I was involved with that, but that was using desmopressin for various research studies with a cardiologist, for example. But during the I should perhaps say that my initial work as the MRC Research Fellow was done, if you like, it was laboratory research work. I was very fortunate. In those days, I had a full-time technician. I was the youngest researcher in the department. I was given a whole-time technician. It was a luxury you don't get these days, and that allowed me to do the research work, but also to spend a lot of my time doing the clinical work that I mentioned earlier. And so I've not been terribly helpful, perhaps, have I?
As I understand your answer, Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that the majority of your research has been related to clotting disorders, blood coagulation, in a range of different respects. So I think that is the answer to the question I asked. Just on the issue of laboratory testing, if we could have, please, Shomik, again, Professor Ludlam's statement, WITN 3428001. Professor, is your screen back?
May I just ask, Professor, can you see Miss Richards?
Yes, I can, thank you.
So
yes.
Everything's okay with your screen?
Yes, it was a temporary glitch for about half a minute.
Right, thank you.
And can you see the document that's come up on screen now, your statement?
I can, yes.
Shomik, could we have page 14, please, paragraph 43? So paragraph 43, thank you. So if we pick this up in the third line, it says that in addition to previous routine investigations, there was a need to increase the surveillance of the immune and virological status of all patients. We'll come on to the details of that later in the week, Professor. And then you say this, as the necessary laboratory investigations were not available routinely in the NHS, additional resources were sought and acquired to do this from providers of research funds. Which providers of research funds provided resources to the centre in the 80s to enable this kind of laboratory investigation to be undertaken?
The Scottish Home and Health Department had a research fund that I applied to and successfully got funding, and also the Medical Research Council. I applied for funding, and they supported our work.
Was any funding received in relation to this and the laboratory investigations that you're describing here from pharmaceutical companies?
No, I don't think so. No, this was, no, I have no recollection. No, this was funded by Scottish Home and Health Department and the Medical Research Council.
Now, again, focusing on the first half of the 1980s, did you hold regular outpatient clinics at the centre for patients with bleeding disorders?
In the first half of the 1980s, the clinics were held in the medical outpatient department. I think on a Tuesday afternoon. I think I tried to keep one clinic a month for reviewing patients with haemophilia, and at that time, thanks to my predecessor having had a good liaison with a physiotherapist, we had a physiotherapist who came to the clinics, and all the patients had their joints measured by goniometry, which was really quite unheard of at the time, and I'm interested that it's now come back into fashion the last few years as a way of monitoring patients. But my predecessor, Dr. Davis, had set this up before I arrived, and so we had a physiotherapist who came to my clinics. As you see, it was in a general medical outpatient department. When we moved into what became the Haemophilia Centre in the mid-1980s, then the patients came to that unit and everything was very much more brought together. That's where we saw the outpatients and the review clinics and the office it was a very, very much better arrangement.
In the first half of the 80s, in the outpatients as you've described, how often did the regular clinics take place? Were they weekly, monthly?
Well, I had a clinic every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, and on Tuesdays, once a month, I think I tried to keep the clinic predominantly for people with haemophilia. I could see them on other Tuesdays, but Tuesday was also the day when I saw new patients, not just new patients with bleeding disorders or thrombotic conditions, but new patients with leukemia or lymphoma, or just anemias that general practitioners wanted advice about.
And patients with a severe bleeding disorder, how often did they have regular scheduled appointments? Were they seen 6 monthly or 4 monthly or annually? What were the arrangements in 1980?
It was a bit variable depending on the particular individual, but it would be, most of them would be seen at least every 6 months. People with severe haemophilia, they would be coming up and being reviewed also with their acute bleeds in the haemophilia centre. So one got very used to seeing them on a day-to-day basis, if I can put it that way, as well as at the review clinics.
And then one final question on, as it were, the organisation and structure for haemophilia care at that time. If we go back to page 12 of the statement, please, Shomik, paragraph 36. If we just go down to 36. It says here that the SHHD, so Scottish Home and Health Department, provided the framework for collaboration by convening regular meetings to consider arrangements for the provision of the service for patients. Now, again, just dealing with the period 1980 through to 1986-7 and not any later time, what role did the SHHD play in the organisation and delivery of haemophilia services in Edinburgh?
Well, the SHHD convened these meetings, led, if I can put it this way, they invited us to these meetings. And so they were providing, if you like, proactively developing collaboration with blood transfusion and themselves. So they knew what was going on, they knew what our needs were, and it provided, I think, a particularly useful conduit for discussions between haemophilia directors and SNBTS, which were so important in trying to provide clotting factor concentrates for treating the patients.
And during this period, the first half of the 80s, how regular or how frequent were the meetings that were organised by SHHD?
They were about once a year. There may have been twice a year. They started in the 70s, before my time in Edinburgh, I believe. I think they were about once a year. Might have been twice a year, but in about 1982, it became clear that there was a need to have more frequent meetings. And so a subgroup was set up of the haemophilia directors from Edinburgh and Glasgow, and some blood transfusion representatives under the chairmanship of Dr. George MacDonald, who was a senior haematologist in Glasgow and co-director of the Glasgow Haemophilia Centre. And he convened some meetings to take forward various projects in relation to supply of treatment, particularly for patients, between about 1982 2 or 3 and 85, 86.
So I note the time, and I'm going to move on to a new topic. So is this the appropriate moment for a break?
Yes, just a couple of questions, if I may, just to give me an impression of the service. Where geographically did most of your patients come from? Did those patients in Fife, for instance, go to Dundee?
That was one of our difficulties. We served a very large geographical area. Patients in the south of Fife, Kirkcaldy and around there, Dunfermline, came to Edinburgh. We had patients down as far as Berwick upon Tweed. So it was a very large area, a population of about 1.5 million. So the size of a haemophilia centre is roughly proportional to the population it serves. We were a relatively small haemophilia centre as centres go compared with some of the ones in Manchester or London that you've been hearing about in the past. We had about 40 or 50 people with severe bleeding disorders, but it was a long journey. If you lived in Kirkcaldy, bleeds often started overnight. You'd wake up in the morning, got a bleed in your knee, phone for an ambulance. You might wait half an hour for an ambulance. You trundle over to Edinburgh, an hour and a half or so, possibly picking up other patients on the way. You came up to our Ward 23, sat in the haemophilia centre, the one room. Eventually the cryoprecipitate would arrive. You probably set the drip up yourself because you're pretty good at it. And when it had run through, you perhaps go around and see the other people that you knew in the ward. You then wait until the ambulance came sometime in the afternoon to take you home again. You might have to come back the following day. I put it in this way because the distances were long, the bleeding was frequent. It was no way for young men to grow up. Children needed to be at school, not coming up for treatment for bleeds.
And the same, no doubt, would apply in the borders, because the borders would go to you, I would imagine.
Yes, we served most of the borders. Between Edinburgh and Glasgow, there was a sort of watershed. Some of the patients who lived near Glasgow sometimes came to Edinburgh because they had family in Edinburgh, and some of the ones that lived close to Edinburgh went to Glasgow because they had families there. Didn't cause us any difficulties, but there were long distances. And Glasgow, you need to take this up if you wish with Professor Lowe, served the islands and the Highlands and Islands. You know, they were considerable distances, and treatment and investigation challenges.
Well, thank you for that. The other question really arose out of your describing how some of the treatment was delivered under your supervision, and you were describing that as part of a section when counsel was asking you about your routine, and you were saying, as I understood it, that because you had so much work to do of all sorts, of which haemophilia care was only a part amounting to roughly a day a week, you would supervise the care rather than provide it personally. So supervision, if I can just have a sense of what that involved, because plainly it wasn't sitting with the clinical assistant when the clinical assistant was providing the care and supervising in that direct, sitting on the shoulder type style. What did it actually involve?
Well, two sorts of it. Excuse me. There was the supervision of the registrars, and a lot of that was done because they walked around the hospital with me, and we discussed management of patients as we walked down the corridors between wards. The clinical assistants I think, I can't remember the exact details, but I would have told them about haemophilia. They'd have met the patients, they'd have met the haemophilia sister who had been in post for 2 or 3 years and become very knowledgeable about haemophilia. And my guess is that I ran the clinics to begin with, and they sat in on them. And then when they were familiar with the way I did things and sort of investigations we were doing and so on, and they would take over. But there was a very low threshold for coming to seek my help and opinion. I always used to say to everyone I kept the door shut to my room to keep the noise out, not to keep people out, because there was a noisy office outside with typists and phones ringing and so on.
So it was supervision in the sense of they could come to you and get advice if they needed it once they had had a degree of apprenticeship.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, we're having a break. At all the breaks that we'll have, whether it's overnight or whether it's during the day, the general rule is this, and I just want to remind you of it as I do to all witnesses. You're giving evidence. You must not discuss your evidence, either the evidence you have given or any evidence which you think you might be asked to give, with anyone, whoever they are, whether it's your solicitor, counsel, your wife even, with anyone. You can talk about anything else you like. Now we'll take a break until, let's say, 11:45. 11:45.
Thank you.